Hello, my name is John Ernst, and this presentation is about what the Catholic intellectual tradition is, and how it's demonstrated in St. Thomas Aquinas' moral philosophy. The Catholic intellectual tradition can be described as a 2,000-year-old conversation. Anytime there's intellectual inquiry that is related to, and therefore can comment on, an aspect of the Catholic faith, it is part of the Catholic intellectual tradition, and this inquiry can be in any field. In response, the Catholic understanding of subjects may be developed, or the insights of the Catholic faith may cause developments in the understanding of those involved in the inquiry. Over the many years, this inquiry has taken many forms, as contemporary cultures and intellectual developments shed new light on the conversation. The knowledge that this process arrives at is passed down from generation to generation, and thus it is a tradition. This knowledge is found in the content of the tradition, which includes any documents somehow involved in the process, like sacred scripture, scientific writings, prayers, formulations of the faith, and even rituals. The Catholic tradition has a specific way to approach this conversation. 6 main characteristics of this approach are the affirmations of the continuity of faith and reason, the admiration of past wisdom, the call to work for the common good, the communal dimension of human persons, the need to utilize all fields of knowledge, and the sacramental presence of God in life. As a theology and philosophy major, I considered how St. Thomas Aquinas, a Catholic theologian and philosopher, demonstrated this approach to knowledge in his own intellectual inquiries. I found that Aquinas utilized this approach by considering both the continuity of faith and reason, as well as the communal dimension of all human persons, when formulating his moral philosophy. First, the Catholic intellectual tradition asserts that truths found logically and truths of the faith cannot contradict. Aquinas demonstrated intellectual inquiry that thoroughly investigated what is logically true, as well as how that truth is consistent with the Catholic faith. To do this, he included both Aristotle's logical moral philosophy and knowledge from divine revelation into his own moral philosophy. Aristotle logically came up with his ethics by first observing that all living things desire happiness, and thus act in ways that they think will bring about their happiness. He also observed that they can achieve this happiness or satisfaction by acting in accord with their nature. For example, a dog would be happier if it had someone to play with, and a tree would be more satisfied if it had room to grow, as it's of the nature of dogs to play, and it's of the nature of trees to grow. Aristotle also observed that what's unique about the nature of human beings is our reason. Therefore, he taught that human beings could achieve happiness or well-being through using their reasons. He specified certain intellectual and moral dispositions that are in accord with reason, which, when practiced habitually, allow the person to achieve happiness. And he called these habits virtues. For example, in this picture, the man on the left is demonstrating the moral virtue of magnanimity or generosity, and he's doing it in a way that his reason tells him would probably bring about the well-being of the other man. In some ways, Aristotle's moral philosophy was very different from that of Aquinas. For example, based on 1 Corinthians 13:13 and the interpretation of that verse in sacred tradition, Aquinas taught that there are 3 theological virtues: faith, hope, and charity, and that these can only be given by God's grace. Aristotle, as a Greek man living before Christ, did not consider any of those to be virtues, and had no concept of the grace of God in acquiring virtue. Aquinas also taught that the final end that all humans desire is beatitude, or union with God, while Aristotle simply taught that happiness is the final end we desire. However, nonetheless, Aquinas incorporated Aristotle's ethics into his own, due to the truths he found in it. He wrote at length about the Cardinal Virtues, which was his way of grouping the moral and intellectual virtues, like what Aristotle talked about. He identified them as prudence, temperance, courage, and justice. Aquinas agreed with Aristotle that these virtues are necessary for our happiness and perfection as human beings. He also agreed that these virtues can be acquired through repetition of corresponding acts, and that acting out the moral and intellectual virtues is acting in accord with our final end. But Aquinas showed the continuity of faith with these truths by adding that charity, or the love of God, perfects the cardinal virtues, and that the final end that humans desire is beatitude with God. Thus, he did not ignore truths from divine revelation about God's relation to us, but also did not ignore the reason of Aristotle. The Catholic intellectual tradition also includes the aspect of considering the communal dimension of human persons. This means that the intellectual should keep in mind that, as human beings, our nature requires us to have togetherness with others. Aquinas' philosophy of justice demonstrates this aspect by teaching that we ought to have right relation or communion with one another and specifying the ways that this should be done. He considered this of such great importance that he made justice one of the 4 cardinal virtues. The way to achieve justice is to provide others what is due to them. He wrote that there are different kinds of justice because there are different kinds of relationships among people and communities. General or legal justice is an individual rendering what is owed to a community, for example, through paying taxes. Distributive justice is a community rendering what is owed to an individual. For example, a government creating public parks for all and not banning individual people without reason. Commutive justice involves individuals rendering what is owed to others, other individuals. For example, paying a fair price for someone's service. Aquinas also demonstrated the communal dimension of humans by teaching that restitution must be made for sins against justice. It's also noteworthy that he considered this aspect of such great importance that he taught that even actions done by oneself have communal impacts, as every action in some way will have consequences on others. Lastly, humans aren't only made for communion with other people, but also for communion with God. Therefore, Aquinas describes religion as a moral virtue under the category of justice, since it's giving God what's owed to him, namely praise. Thank you so much for watching.